Good afternoon, good morning in the States. Welcome to our panel discussion titled Battling the Backlash, the Future of Gender Equality in the Western Balkans. My name is Daniel Hegedűs and work as Regional Director for Central Europe at the German Marshall Fund. And I'm warmly welcoming our today panelists, Angel Dimitrievski, Rising CE Fellow at the German Marshall Fund, Adriana Zaharievich, Principal Research Fellow at the Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory at the University of Belgrade, and Irena Cvetkovic, Executive Director at Coalition Margins. Anti-gender movements across the Western Balkans have gained momentum, challenging hard-won human rights and undermining already fragile democratic norms. Backed by religious and far-right actors, these movements target women and sexual minorities, particularly in education and in relation to their freedom of assembly. They block gender-sensitive curricula, often oppose even support services for victims of sexual violence, and aggressively resist pride parades. But this is more than just a simple backlash. What we are witnessing here is the rise of a growing, often transatlantic alliance of illiberal forces that is reshaping the political discourse, not only around gender and identity, but also around core democratic values such as fundamental freedoms, equality, and anti-discrimination. Framed as an alleged culture war, this development constitutes a fundamental attack not only on the recognition and rights of vulnerable groups, but also on the very foundations of pluralist liberal democracy as we know it. What is unfolding in the Western Balkans and parts of Central and Eastern Europe is particularly tragic. Due to the weaker social embeddedness of gender equality, the existential consequences are more severe, both for the movement and for individual activists. This holds true not only in terms of limited resources, especially following the termination of US foreign assistance, but also in terms of the physical security and mental well-being of those on the front lines. But no one should fall into the illusion that this is merely a particularity of the Western Balkans. The culture war rhetoric of illiberal forces and their anti-gender narratives that challenge the very foundations of pluralist liberal democracy is growing louder across the European Union and the United States alike. Illiberal ambitions recognize no borders, not those of countries, not those of the European Union, and not even a geographic divide like the Atlantic. And this is why solidarity and support networks committed to gender equality and democracy must pay close attention to regions like the Western Balkans. Regarding the housekeeping rules, we will begin with a 15 to 20 minutes presentation of Angel's paper and his main findings, followed by the comments of Adriana and Irena in 10-15 minutes each. This will be followed by a Q&A session, so you are welcome to submit your questions anytime using the Q&A function of Zoom, and we will do our best to incorporate your questions into the discussion. I also would like to remind you that the event is recorded and will be made available online, the YouTube channel of the German Marshall Fund. And last but not least, I would like to mention that Angel's work at GMF and his paper is part of our flagship project, the Rising CE Fellowship Program, which supports innovative research projects conducted by the next generation of policy analysts and civil society activists from Central and Eastern Europe and the Western Balkans. I hope you will enjoy the conversation. And having said that, I would like to give the floor to Angel.
Thank you, Daniel, for the introduction. And before I start with my insights on the paper, I would also like to say thanks to GMF for supporting me in creating this paper for now more than a year, and people who were behind the process like Zuzana and Nick, who was involved in the editing, but also the larger peer support group who was very crucial to the production of this paper. I will share my screen now. And you can maybe just confirm if you see my slides. Okay. Daniel gave a nice overview of what I'm going to talk about in uh, um, in terms of the findings of my paper. I have been working on exploring the rise of the anti-gender movement as a larger threat to democracy in the Western Balkans, with North Macedonia and Serbia being my case studies in this paper. So in that regard, it's important to maybe mention the context in the Western Balkans, that the legal framework and the political environment is increasingly geared to suppress the rights and visibility of marginalized groups, namely women and LGBTQ plus people. And in some cases, the ability to obtain basic access to rights such as health rights, freedom of movement, education, and housing. Um, I've placed these statistics because I think they depict how the situation is mirrored in the region. In a 2023 public opinion survey, we found out that majorities in each country say that LGBTQ plus ideas were imported from the West, with the average being 62%. And across the region, the majority said that they would seek a cure for their child if they discovered that it identified as LGBTQ plus, with the percentage being highest in Kosovo, 57%. And when asked whether being LGBTQ plus is a sickness, the average answer that it was 51%, the highest in Kosovo and the lowest in Albania. And these statistics only show that the society in Western Balkans struggles to accept differences, but also that people with marginalized identities, who are the most vulnerable, can be easily made into scapegoats to instill fear and distrust in society. But despite this, let's say, negative context, we must acknowledge that there was some progress made in the past 5 years in terms of rights. Namely, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, North Macedonia, and Montenegro have made some advancements. For example, North Macedonia adopted an anti-discrimination law in 2020 that includes gender and sexual orientation, and then restructured its Commission for Protection Against Discrimination, and held its first Pride Parade in 2019. And only a year after Montenegro recognized same-sex civil partnerships, though full implementation of this law still remains challenged. And Bosnia and Herzegovina also organized its first Pride Parade in 2019, and this marked some kind of advancements in the region, mainly led by civil society actors. But then with every advancement comes pushback. In our case, it was a more organized pushback, which we are exploring in many different contexts, but we also know it as anti-gender movement. Just as a very theoretical framework, what anti-gender movements represent, they are international or transnational movements opposing what they call gender ideology or gender theory. And they comprise of actors with various characteristics, but they can differ from the context and the time of where they operate. But kind of like the same denominator for all of them is that they attack at least one of the three ends that they claim to defend. First is nature, then is nation, and normality. And in the Western Balkans, and specifically North Macedonia and Serbia, anti-gender narratives are significantly shifting how average citizens even respond to words related to gender or LGBTQ plus people in general. And anti-gender narratives have promoted the claim that the population is being forced to become gay or transgender. They have spread false accusations that transgender people will enter bathrooms and rape women or children. They have labeled feminists as selfish women responsible for the decline of fertility rates, presented human rights defenders or minority groups as powerful elites that try to lure children into a homosexual agenda, and of course demonized the West as the exporter of these toxic ideologies. In my paper, I have tried to map who are the dominant actors in Serbia and North Macedonia when it comes to the anti-gender movement. But just for context, the research and theoretical framework identifies three types of actors in the anti-gender movement, which define as old, new, and allies. Old anti-gender actors are usually considered to be tied to the Catholic Church and right-wing institutions, usually located in the United States. New ones are members of the transnational anti-gender movements, which today we are seeing it as different types of groups of concerned parents or concerned citizens, now even registered as civil society organizations. And allies can include the media, academia, and public intellectuals. So in that context, in both North Macedonia and Serbia, religious leaders and institutions have played a central role in advancing these anti-gender and anti-LGBTIQ plus narratives, particularly in opposing gender equality legislation. And figures such as the Bishop Jakov Stobiski of the Macedonian Orthodox Church and Patriarch Porphyrie of the Serbian Orthodox Church have used public platforms to spread discrimination, but also to pressure state institutions. Um, the slight difference between the two countries is that North Macedonia has seen the rise of new anti-gender actors, particularly groups of self-proclaimed concerned parents who mobilize under the guise of protecting children. And these groups operate through formal and informal networks, such as the Coalition for Protection of the Children, which is a registered civil society organization, network of more than 30 organizations, businesses, and political parties even. And they are supported by international anti-gender organizations like Family Watch International. And in North Macedonia, since the COVID-19 pandemic, they have gained access to policy-making spaces, have blocked gender inclusive reforms, and organized one widespread transphobic campaign, including the screening of the transphobic movie What is a Woman by the far-right figure Matt Walsh. In Serbia, though, anti-gender discourse is not only advanced by the religious community, but my interviewees in the research have repeatedly stated that also government figures are quite heavily involved in this rhetoric. So President Aleksandar Vučić and his Serbian Progressive Party have actively obstructed LGBTI rights, and this is notably most evident in trying to ban the Euro Pride in 2022, while enabling far-right religious protesters to overrun this event. But also other government figures like the minister Milica Đurđević-Stamenkovski, who have institutionalized a rhetoric through initiatives such as the Belgrade Family Days, who have promoted different heteronormative family models. Then I would go on to say that my paper also deals with two battlegrounds that I have explored and that were kind of like the, let's say, targeted by this movement. And the first one is education. And in that regards, anti-gender actors have intervened at various stages of policy processes in education. And in both countries, they have used similar tactics. In North Macedonia, the movement started to mobilize itself starting from 2019 after a pilot program on comprehensive sexuality education and gender-sensitive education has been allowed to have a limited institutional presence for some time. In Serbia, however, the situation was a bit different. So the Ministry of Education made a very significant and swift turnaround. The Ministry of Education in Serbia and an organization called Incest Trauma Center had previously toured the country together, training teachers on how to talk to pupils, analyze and work with topics related to sexuality education. And they have promoted together this educational package, also known as Learning About Child Sexual Violence for primary and high schools. But then the policy was overturned after 5 months due to pressure from far-right intellectuals, anti-gender groups, and clerics. In both cases, a strong anti-Western rhetoric emerged, framing the modernization of education as a threat and labeling both proposed policies as contrary to the tradition and a danger to the traditional family structure. Different disinformation tactics were often employed, such as claiming that these policies aim to sexualize children, to teach them about sex at an early age, and to change their sexual orientation or gender identity, and in extreme cases, alleging that they promoted necrophilia and group sex. So anti-gender actors in that sense in the Western Balkans have inserted themselves into education policy making with a very determined message and agenda and vision of education liberated from the liberal Western agenda. But in essence, their ultimate aim in challenging these policies is to maintain the status quo and to prevent any kind of visibility of gender and LGBTQ plus minorities. And in that regard, in 2017, the Incest Trauma Center lost its battle with Serbia Ministry of Education, which withdrew its support to this reform under the influence of right-wing groups and intellectuals and religious figures. While in North Macedonia this year in April, we have seen the revocation of several laws on primary education, law on textbooks, and law on secondary education that were amended to remove discrimination categories based on gender, sexual orientation, and gender identity, and practically to erase a whole community from education. And it is really important to mention that all of these changes were made in a non-transparent procedure without involving the expert community and in violation of domestic and international regulations. And then the second battleground that my paper deals with are the pride parades, which also fundamentally tackle the freedom of assembly aspect. And it's important to mention that pride parades in the Western Balkans have a very strong political significance, and the movements always insist that this event should be primarily seen as protests rather than celebrations, as they embody the political struggles that the community confronts daily. And beyond being a platform for public visibility, the parades convey crucial political messages and demands in response to the inadequate institutional frameworks. In regards to that, in 2022, the Serbian Orthodox Church organized large-scale mobilization against hosting Europride in Belgrade. Days before the event, it gathered thousands of people for the so-called Litany for the Salvation of Serbia in front of the Church of St. Sava. And Patriarch Porfiria led a religious service focused on the sanctity of marriage and the family. And participants carried religious icons as well as banners reading Kosovo is the heart of Serbia, flags of Imperial Russia, and photos of Vladimir Putin. At the last moment, the government announced the cancellation of Europride, despite lacking the constitutional authority to ban public gatherings, something similar that we are seeing in Budapest right now. However, the event ultimately went ahead, albeit on a reduced scale, and thanks to the persistent efforts of civil society organizations and pressure from the international community. It should be noted, though, that it was heavily policed and that attendees faced hate speech and there were instances of physical violence. 1 year after, the Macedonian Orthodox Church organized protest 1 week after the Skopje Pride Parade, which was also named as a protest against laws. It was a protest against the laws on gender equality and the civil registry law. And the protesters, many of whom were transported to the event at the expense of the church, gathered again in front of the church of St. Clement Ohridski with banners reading, "We don't want men in female bedrooms, stop the modern Inquisition, and protect the children." And here we had prominent religious leaders on the stage, including the highest figure of the Macedonian Orthodox Church, Archbishop Stefan, but also he was joined by academics such as Katica Kilavkova from the Macedonian Academy of Sciences and Arts, who both of them spread different kind of narratives that said that basically they don't want the promotion of homosexuality in education. And Katica Kulavkova described transgender identities as Western constructs imposed on the region. Also, mainstream politicians have co-opted anti-gender rhetoric in regards to pride parades. In Serbia, Vučić cited security concerns and the state alleged inability to protect peaceful protesters from far-right violence as a reason for issuing the ban on Europride. Another key reason given here was the ongoing Kosovo issue, with government officials arguing that the state could not simultaneously address national security and civic liberties. And this presented this false binary that Serbia either had to choose between national security or civil rights. In North Macedonia, a similar situation happened when Prime Minister Christian Mickoski, who came to power last year, used similar rhetoric, in which he centers the prosperity of the nation, which can only be achieved if young people have more babies, while promoting the heteronormative definition of marriage as a union between a woman and a man. And finally, I would like to focus on the recommendations for this from this paper, which I found it very valuable as a process of work on them. And the first one being to think about restructuring and expanding our alliances. And to counter this very organized anti-gender movement, we must think of alliances. But first, I think that we need to analyze and question structures and networks that are affected by generational, but not just by generational, but also by value-driven clashes among feminist activists, in which trans-exclusionary radical feminism is often framed as a form of women's rights protection. Then we must create networks and channels for knowledge sharing between senior activists and younger activists, in which we here it's essential for this knowledge sharing to be without any hierarchies, so that senior activists are willing to pass the knowledge, but also for younger activists to not be abandoned that it all started from them, and to kind of like acknowledge this legacy that they have behind them. Also to preserve the existing alliances that we have within institutions. They are very little, but to kind of like keep these people on our side, and in some cases offer protection because they are so marginalized inside the institutions when they stand in defense of these values. And this, I think, is also important to form new alliances that go beyond our feminist and LGBTI circles, with groups that demonstrate some liberal values, but they don't work explicitly in this context. So I think this is a very a wide potential field that we haven't used that much. Secondly, I would suggest that feminist and queer organizations must prioritize safeguarding education and cultural institutions, because they have been the main front where anti-gender movements have been acting. And this approach not only challenges the anti-gender movement, but also sets a broader standard for policy adoption in the Western Balkans, because we have seen how policy adoption has crippled in this sense, but also education and culture as the key fronts where change of attitudes is happening among ordinary citizens, let's say. On a more strategic note, the EU enlargement process and the Berlin process can be used as a mechanism tools for inserting this gender-sensitive perspective, because the Berlin process have been criticized for lacking a intersectional gender perspective, and gender was often treated as a standalone topic, not as an intersectional topic. So there is a possibility for feminist and LGBT organizations to build wider alliances within the Berlin process. The civil society forum actually that enables them to build these alliances. And I would end with this, although not being less important. I think that focusing on our care systems and well-being, to focus internally, is really what we need now. So feminist and queer activists have faced crises that directly threaten our personal safety. Many of us have been smeared in the media and attacked on the streets. Our offices have been vandalized. We have been target of hate speech, and there have been calls for our erasure, and we have received death threats in some cases. So in that regard, to care about ourselves is existentially important, but also this care needs to be embodied in the organizations where we work. And this is something that I propose in my paper that both donors and organizations can adopt into their way of thinking, how we think about care. But I must say that to discuss and strategize about care in these unprecedented times when funding is cut to organizations is really hard. But to recognize that care and healing must take place, I think that this is the real political takeaway from this recommendation. And just to conclude that the future of feminist and LGBTI organizing is at the moment under serious threat as it confronts this well-coordinated and, as we have seen, regionally entrenched anti-gender movement. And this challenge is compounded by the global spread of anti-gender rhetoric, which now has undermined human rights work, has shut down essential services, and weakened the strategic capacity of activists. And the current moment might feel like one of the most difficult crises we have faced within our movement, but we are no strangers to navigating different kind of adversities. And to move forward, I think that the path lies in these recommendations I gave mainly in strengthening our systems of care, deepening our mutual support, reimagining our alliances, and basically defending the institutions where we think change is still possible to happen. I will stop sharing now, and I will give the floor to others.
Yes, thank you so much, Angel. Thank you for this great presentation, and particularly many thanks for your very insightful and valuable, actionable recommendations. Dear attendees, if you have any questions to Angel, feel free to submit it in the Q&A function of Zoom. And I would like to turn to Irena, because with coalition margins, you have been at the forefront of the fight for gender equality in North Macedonia for the past years. How do the findings of Angel resonate actually with your experience in the country and potentially in the broader region? Over to you.
Thank you, Daniel. And Angel, congratulations. I really enjoyed reading your paper and now watching the presentation. It's really a comprehensive overview of what is happening. Before I start with my reflection on this topic, just to say that, yes, I was introduced as Executive Director of Coalition Margins, but I'm not anymore. And there is a reason, and I will start with this. I spent my last 4 years monitoring the anti-gender movement and trying to create a strategic response to anti-gender movement. I spent a lot of time researching, writing, and at the end, what I found out that I think in this moment, civil society is the only institution that is on the forefront of this fight. And I think civil society, and I will say we because I still feel that I'm part of civil society, we are doing something wrong and we need to immediately start doing something else. I have a short reflection with a few points. And the first point will be exactly this. We heard what Angel was sharing. We know what is happening around the globe, not only in the Western Balkans. The election of Donald Trump has actually really established this new normal. And when I speak about this new normal, I believe that we are living in this new normal that demands a new language, and yet we see civil society still speaks the language of the 20th century. We hear a lot about today talking about contemporary fascism. We had even a lecture, me and Angel, we were jointly on that lecture by Professor Jelisaveta Blagojevic, talking to us about the contemporary fascism and how it diverse, how it is different from the historical fascism, but what is unique in this contemporary fascism, she explained it as this contempt for the weaker. So I think we can freely say that we live now in this new normal in a proto-fascistic societies. And this new normal is shaped by disinformation, by hate speech, by moral panics, and some kind of authoritarian drift. As I said, civil society just could not keep its pace on. The civil society still speaks this old language through policy briefs, awareness campaigns, capacity buildings. So in my first point, I would say that especially donors, and I would include here the international actors, especially European Union, must not only support civil society, but should trust civil society, because in me and Angel, and of course, again, with Adriana, through our through academic networks, we are actually living this reality for a while, and we have been testing different solutions, we have been testing different approaches, and we need a support by powerful institutions, a support that is based on trust. Just we need time, space, and resources to rethink our strategies, to take risks, and be wrong sometimes. And with the final goal of this new language that this new normal is demanding is to jointly imagine new political horizons, because without that, we are just surviving. We are not transforming societies. Angel was speaking about anti-gender mobilizations in education and on pride parades, and I would like to also add something on this. Education has always been a front line of the ideological battle. It is now again. So anti-gender groups, as Angel shared what they are doing, I would just like to explain why they're attacking education. Because they know, the same as we know, that schools don't just produce workers. This is a spaces where we shape worldviews, where we shape human values, and where we shape citizens. So we have always been accused by the anti-gender groups of pushing ideology, gender ideology. But education has always been ideological. The question is whose values are being taught, whose ideologies are being incorporated. So what we fight for is this democratic, inclusive education. But what we are having in our educational systems now, and what the anti-gender groups are trying to do, is to restore through education obedience, hierarchy, and exclusion. So if I might add another action point, especially for donors and international organizations, that I think we have to stop treating this ideological battle as a clash between equals. This is not neutrality, this is complicity. There are, of course, two sides here, but one side is the side of the democracy, and we need allies in this side. I mentioned pride parades, and attacking pride parade is also not without a reason. Again, Angel gave great overview of what is happening, but just to add that pride parades for us is the only way of saying that we exist, that we are here, and that we are not going away. And we are now in this new normal, living in a context where our communities are completely stripped of political and social power. And the only resistance that we have is is our visibility. So parades make us visible not only as LGBTQI people, but also as ordinary people, people who are every day on the streets, people who pay taxes, and etc. And of course, people that demand dignity, safety, and rights. So when donors and international organizations are not supporting our prides when our prides are political act, then we have again a democratic problem, and we have witnessed this in North Macedonia for the first time this year. That again, I will connect this with the trust that we need. Trusting LGBTQI organizations to reclaim prides as protests, clearly opposing harmful ideologies and fighting for change. It is for me the only way how we can resist, or how we can at least find our space within this new normal. Angel mentioned the church, and that will be my last point. Again, connected with the first point that I made, the church offers hope, and what we offer is policy reports. And in North Macedonia and Serbia, the church is the most trusted institutions. It's not because of faith alone. Yes, we have a lot of religious people, but because church and religion offers belonging, meaning, and hope. My colleague works a lot with rural women, and in many rural areas, which is 80% of our countries, the only civic space that exists is organized by the church. While we stay confined to Skopje and Belgrade, trained by this donor-driven advocacy, endless reporting, the church, together with the anti-gender actors, builds on the ground real relationships with people, showing up, speaking plainly, offering community. They promise hope after life. And again, we respond with policy papers. We need to offer more. And donors must invest in this people-centered, sustaining grassroots work. So not just visibility and metrics. Without that, we are losing the ground completely. So I will finish with, I have a good and a bad news. The bad news is that the anti-gender narratives are anxiety-driven, and they're highly effective as any anxiety-driven narrative at short-term mobilizations. The good news is that they lack vision. So fear can mobilize, but it cannot sustain. It cannot build a future. And their weakness should be our opening. So to truly counter anti-gender initiatives, we need more than disinformation checks or reactive campaigns. We really need to change the script, not just to defend space, but now we need to create it. New language, new coalitions, and new forms of belonging. And for that, again, we need donors and international allies who don't just fund resistance, but invest in imagination. That would be for now for myself.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Irena, for your very motivating and refreshing contribution. You talked to my heart, and actually even beyond the gender equality movement, I fully agree with you that civil society needs to be more political if we would like actually to resist this new reality, what you called proto-fascism. And my question would be, and don't answer it now, but we can revert to this in the Q&A, is a very simple how. How can actually civil society successfully proceed with that transformation in a world when actually civil society is already a main culprit and attacked in the public by authoritarian forces for being already too political? And second, when we see that donors withdrew from supporting causes which are deemed to be too political. So I fully agree with you regarding the goals, but I think it's worth to discuss actually the how we achieve the goals you set. Adriana, you are both as a scholar and as a public intellectual, a very central person of the feminist movement and the gender equality movement in Serbia. And I think your context is particularly interesting in Serbia because you experience the same anti-gender backlash, while your countries have been also experiencing a very intense grassroots opposition to illiberal and authoritarian governance over the past couple of months. And And my question is, on the one hand, what are your takeaways when you are living in these two parallel worlds? And the second, what do you think, how could actually synergies created between between the gender equality movement and the grassroots social opposition to illiberal and authoritarian governance we see in Serbia, but also in other countries throughout the region? Over to you.
Thank you, Daniel. This is a very up-to-the-point question, but previous to referring and saying something to that, I want to thank Angel and GMF for inviting, Angel for creating this wonderful text and a wonderful list of recommendations. Yes, I am fully with Irena, which was very clear on my face. I was smiling all along and very appreciatively. But on the other hand, I am also in the position of constantly thinking about what is to be done. And certain points that are highlighted in what Angel gave us, also in the presentation, are important, and we need to be reminded of that, even though the external factors, such as the funders, have to be reminded of that space that we all need to rethink, to breathe, to recuperate, and also to find new languages and new strategies to counter what is going on. Let me position myself. I am here in Belgrade. As I said when we met just half an hour ago, my day began at the higher court, one of the major institutions in judicial system in Serbia, because of the student who is being detained. The 500 of us or so were protesting that detainment. This also happens after the 17 days when the informal academic group called Rebellious University was spending in front of the government building, blocking the major thoroughfare because of the 4 months of not being paid their salaries. So the moment in Serbia is very specific. It's 7 months since the protest started. The protest comprised both students, citizens, academic community, and all different kinds of social sectors that joined that protest. It is a very strong protest, obviously. It's something which changed the social tissue. And I'm mentioning all of this for a reason, not just because it's incredibly important, and it's still not well known, even in the wider region of the Balkans, let alone in the European Union or in transatlantic spaces. But also because of the topic that brought us today here. Anti-gender is simply non-existent in the last 7 months. So Daniel, you asked how we combine these two. We don't. Anti-gender mobilizations are not around. And I think that is something which is incredibly important because it tells us something about how anti-gender in the end functions. And there we also, I'm coming back to what Angel was writing, what Irena was saying with this new fascist strategies and spreading the contempt and creating a new ideology that should replace the ideology of contempt that should replace the ideology of love, I would say, diversity, equality, freedoms. And that is that what we have to think about when we think about anti-gender politics is that we are thinking about strategies, about projects. The name of Project 2025, I think, is not accidental. It is a project. It's something that needs to be implemented, that needs to take roots and then spread. I think that this is precisely what is happening in the societies of North Macedonia and what was happening in Serbian society for years, that it was a kind of useful strategy of the powers that be in Serbia, that's the Serbian Progressive Party, which recognized that anti-gender can be useful as a strategy for creating polarizations, for further weakening of institutions that were already very weak or weakened, and naturally democracy, which was already very weak or simply in various ways non-existent. I'm speaking now rather about Serbia. What we also witnessed with this government, and I think that's important, is that while it was useful, gender equality was also used as a strategy. So we had in Serbia gender equality as something which was given or presented, done for the show, so to say, for the EU partners, showing off that we can do it and maybe even do it better than our European partners. So, for example, and this is the only thing which is somehow missing in Angel's paper, I'm sure that he had reasons why he did not put it there, but I will insist on its importance, is that we did have for a while the first openly lesbian prime minister, who was very long in power. She was in power, I think, the longest in the entire Serbian history of representative democracy, so spanning to 19th century. That woman, Ana Brnabić, who is still very powerful in Serbian politics, was an open lesbian. She was outed by the president, not that she outed herself, but in a way, she was the figure of the progressiveness of the Serbian politics and a show that we can do it. Not only that we can do gender equality, but that maybe we can even do it better than, you, the teachers in the EU. However, once that policy turned not so useful, the strategies turned. And what we got instead was the governmental play out of anti-gender politics, which says something about politics itself and how life is not important. Equality is not important. Freedoms are not important. Basically, this is something that can be spared. Since I do have still some time, do I have that time? I wanted to highlight some of the Serbian specificities. I just also want to mention that relatively recently, Roman Kuhar, who was many times mentioned in Angel's paper, and for a reason, and me, we collected a volume which deals with the post-Yugoslav space, and Irena contributed, among other two colleagues, to that volume with the North Macedonian case. And in a way there, we saw that the entire post-Yugoslav space is very ripe with anti-gender politics in different ways, with different historical roots, with different contexts. But what there was important for the Serbian context was, as Angel rightly mentioned, the importance of the intellectuals. Basically, it was the intellectuals, not the parties, not the church, that kind of started the talk about anti-gender policies. It started with education. I will not repeat what we already heard. But interestingly enough, and this speaks in the direction of what I wanted to emphasize about strategy, about project, at that time, that was not useful, so it was not used. At that time, the idea of the educational packages was stopped, but then what happened immediately afterwards was not some kind of institution of a grand anti-gender political framework. Quite to the contrary, it was at that time when Ana Brnabić, the prime minister, came into power. And simultaneously to that, which says something again about a strategy, is that at the time, always vocal, always homophobic, now transphobic as well, anti-feminist Orthodox, Serbian Orthodox Church was very silent for years, for several years. So Orthodox Church, which was for years spreading the anathema of homophobic and anti-feminist messages, was now silent and in support of the openly lesbian prime minister, or at least not attacking the prime minister. However, once the discursive framework changed, which took place basically at the start of the Russian war on Ukraine and a certain kind of change on the geopolitical scene in which Serbia had and has a very interesting, controversial position. Then also the discursive frames changed, which we saw very poignantly and nicely described by Angel in the Europride situation. Europride, needless to be said, was planned for years ahead, so everyone knew about it. No one was surprised. Yet we had a summer with the third term of our prime minister, and at the same time, the banning of Europride. Just to add one little footnote, or rather like an image to this, we had the banned Pride. It was very scary to be there, believe me. But the next day, as it was the day of the funeral of Elizabeth II, the people present at that funeral were the prime minister and her partner, another woman, who represented Serbia, right? Which was absolutely unimaginable in terms of what was happening just the day before in Serbia. So in any case, as we can see, EU priorities, Russian priorities, or other priorities can influence and did influence the strategic use of narratives which ordain lives. They ordain how we feel as humans, what we learn, what is important for us. And in the end, I just want to finish, this was also mentioned in Angel's text, but I just want to highlight the absurdity of that. Once there was a crusade or a blitzkrieg even on the law on gender equality, which is suspended for a year now, which happened in like 4 or 5 months. Really, a blitzkrieg is a good term, led by the patriarch who before was very silent and in the background when that was useful. What happened was not that they used all of those checklists on anti-gender agenda, such as trans issue, anti-LGBT issue, or LGBT issue, or any kind of feminist issues. No, the primary concern of the Serbian Orthodox Church was gender-sensitive language. When we say gender-sensitive language in Serbian context, that is not the X or the asterisk as in German, for example. It is basically professor, professorin. So that's that level of progressiveness, which was considered to be the rape of the Serbian language, even more so of the Serbian being and Serbianhood. So in a way, the language decided on the fate of the law on gender equality. And we are now full year from there. In the meantime, there were 7 months of protests where every frame that we had beforehand was kind of confused. And it seems to me that the anti-gender was not on agenda because it was seen that it will not be useful. Which in the end, I mean, brings me to my conclusion is that somehow we need to be aware of the fact of how something which is a strategy and appears incredibly old, even mythical in its origin, it's a return to something, to the bygone times, the best time, the better times, when everyone knew where they stand and where they should stand, that this is in fact, in a way, disorienting our lives today with such speed and annulling even not only what little freedoms, at least in this region, we have achieved, but also annulling the value of life itself and how to preserve it, what to do to preserve that frame. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adriana, for providing the Serbian context in such an insightful way. Dear attendees, the Q&A is open, so please submit your question to our speakers. And I think we could start with a first round, potentially of 2 questions, one a bit more theoretical and another one very practical, policy-oriented, and potentially also at the level of some recommendations. Regarding the theoretical question. I found actually the recommendations of Angel very intriguing, and almost directly in the first one, there was a reference to reshaping and expanding actually the gender equality networks. And here I think we have an elephant in the room. And this is unfortunately the very deep cleavage and existential conflicts now between the pro-LGBTQI movement and certain parts of the certain parts of the feminist movements, particularly radical feminists. And I think, in a large extent, the success of the anti-gender backlash is a consequence that they succeeded to drive a wedge actually between the feminist movement and the LGBTQI movement, and the progressive agenda could be actually divided. And here my question to all of you, whether you see any ways how this cleavage could be overcome, who could be actually the allies of the LGBTQI movement in the feminist camp, and whether you think that having, at least in some way, it can be also through a sort of compromise, but whether you see any opportunity to reestablish a jointly shared progressive agenda for these two movements anytime in the future. So this would be the first question. And the second question is the policy-related one. So all of the countries we have been talking about are candidate countries of the European Union. And they have the obligation actually to introduce and implement the anti-discrimination legislation of the European Union. And my question is, in your countries, in what sense is the European Union a reference point for the anti-gender movement, either in a negative way that, as Angel briefly mentioned, all of these gender equality things are just imposed by the West in a way, so as a scapegoat or a concept of enemy, or potentially even a positive sense that we have been unfortunately able to witness very successful anti-gender legislations in EU member states. In Bulgaria, in my home country, Hungary, whether these policy developments are considered in some way a source of legitimacy for the anti-gender movement in the Western Balkans, or whether they are referred to at all. So I think we should start with these first two questions, and I am happy to give the floor to Angela.
Yes, thank you, first Irena and Adriana, for your wonderful insights. I really enjoyed hearing you as always. To refer to these questions, why I brought this issue of questioning our alliances is because something in my conversations was repeatedly coming, and also myself and Irena can back me up on this, have experienced this very extreme discussions of inside gender equality networks of actually explaining ourselves with organizations that should work on women's rights. What is a woman, actually? Basically, the title of this ridiculous movie that I mentioned. And I wouldn't argue that this is just the case because we have different generations coming from the 90s. And I mean, we have also generations from the 90s that are supporting also trans women and sex workers. These are actually very determined value-based endpoints that we should tackle. And the two kind of like alternatives I offer here are two possible scenarios that we can do. First is to draw very explicit value lines inside these networks, but that also puts us in a very, again, reactive mode of kind of like saying something that we thought it's already established. And the other one is to simply leave these networks and they legitimize their existence because many of these organizations are actually called inside working groups. They are representing what they call the feminist stance inside institutions. So the second one might be a more, let's say, radical stance, but it's not something that I fear of. I think that if we break these alliances with people that we think that are our allies, there will be a point that true allyship can emerge with some other instances that are actually more in our favor. The second question about the policy-related one. How is EU perceived as a factor in North Macedonia? Currently, EU doesn't enjoy a lot of support. I can say very minimal support, not just because of this topic, but because EU has had a very contradictory attitude towards the name change and different kind of national disputes around North Macedonia. So the credibility started to fall there because the Union obviously has failed to also deliver some promises there. And this was actually the main reason why the confidence in EU standards have fallen, but also this also kind of like adds up to EU being the promoter of these agendas. On this protest that I mentioned in front of the Macedonian Orthodox Church, actually this academic Katica Kilavkova, she was speaking about that transgenderism, as she called it, is a mandatory kind of like checkpoint to have in projects to get access to EU funds, which is of course not true because there is no such thing that you should that transgenderism is a checkpoint in the EU funded projects. But yes, in different instances can be used as a trigger point, but basically not in a way that can be good, because also we have seen that the anti-discrimination EU legislation last month was also stripped away from certain categories, and that international networks like ILGA reacted to this anti-discrimination EU policy being really now not so inclusive as it was before.
Thank you so much. Irena, Adriana, would you like to come in?
Yes, I think regarding, just to be clear, I think that anti-gender didn't invent this discourse, this division within the feminist or queer movement, especially within the feminists. What they did is that they just deepened the discourse that has always existed. The issue of trans, especially women, I would say, I don't think anybody is concerned about trans men, like they don't exist as a group. But the issue of transgender people, the issue of sex work, the issue of pornography has always been debatable within the feminist movement. And I don't think that's a bad thing. Feminism was never dogma. And I think even if you go to the climate change movement against climate change, there are a lot of fractions within this movement. This is healthy for a movement. But what anti-gender group did is really deepen this division, antagonizing us to the point that especially gender critical feminists or trans exclusionary radical feminists forget about the real enemy of the women and focus on a marginalized group. I will never forget an image from a pride parade in London, if I'm not mistaken, where we have this angry gender critical feminist yelling against trans women, and on their back is the police and banks with their bands supporting the community. I'm like, can't you see who is your real enemy? So in that sense, I think what is needed is to go beyond identity-based politics and move towards political and value movements. And when we speak about movement, we should also think beyond civil society organizations. Organizations can be an important part of the movement, but they cannot be the movement. Me and Angel, we have spent a lot of time and nerves in keeping the queer and the feminist movement together, and that is possible in a small country, because these are the people of the country. We know each other, and yes, we have some gender critical feminists that are doing a lot of problems to the movement, but we managed to keep more or less together. I know in Serbia the problem is bigger, and if you go to a bigger country, the problems become even bigger. And maybe quickly move to the second question. I completely agree with what Angel said. At the moment, I think that in this moment, the European Union just really doesn't mean anything for the common people in North Macedonia. Not a bad, not a good thing. We stop caring about the European Union. I spend a lot of time in Brussels advocacy. I spend a lot of time focused on EU accession. And I remember, and again, my point is, our topics, gender equality, LGBTQ rights, were always framed as soft issues for the negotiations, for the accession dialogue. I remember we go 10 years in a row every November in Brussels for an advocacy week. I remember my cherished colleague from Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Alexandra Petric, 3 years in a row showing in front of MEPs, in front of Brussels officials, telling them Russian anti-NGO law will be adopted in Republika Srpska. Please help us. Nothing happened from their side. They waited until the law was adopted, and then they started reacting. So that's why I insist, please trust us. We are on the front lines. We know what is happening. And sometimes we even can vision the contours of the response. We need you, of course, with us, but we are there. And at the end, I think what I wouldn't say maybe the left, but I mean the left, let's say pro-democratic part of the society, we are always so much obsessed with ourselves. We want to exclude TERFs, TERFs want to exclude us, we want to exclude this. I think we are living now in this time that we need a really broader coalitions, and to truly understand broader coalitions means being together with someone that don't think the same as I do, but we share values and goals.
Thank you, Irena. Yeah,
I could just subscribe to the last sentence of Irena's, very much so, because at the point when the trans issue became huge in Serbia, I remember talking to a feminist who is mentioned in Angel's text, Jelena Višnjić, who is a very important figure in the Serbian feminist landscape. And she said to me, I said, is this now becoming an issue out of nowhere? And she said, no, it's not becoming an issue. And then like a year later, she said, do you remember that conversation that we had? It became an issue. And in a way, this is one thing that this issue shares with anti-gender issues, anti-gender politics. And that is that we have a lot of translation work being going on here. Who knows how much has been translated from Orban's Hungary into Vučić's Serbia and into Mickovski's North Macedonia, or to Greece or to Turkey, or the translation maybe goes in different directions, but we are not aware of that. On the same level, so to say, we have the translation, really like a translation of the anti-trans scare, which started at a point in UK and then somehow ended up in Serbia and other places. And there was really a question, as Irena said, I mean, is it really that person whom most of us do not even know, because the trans community is incredibly small, fragile, not visible, not helped by other parts of the movement. Is it really that that person or those persons are the greatest scare than what is being happening at the level of the institutional collapse to which we are witnessing daily? And so this would be my, I mean, I'm continuously surprised, as I was at the beginning of that translational action until today. When it comes to the EU, again, I'm fully subscribing to what the two of you said. I would say that in Serbia today, this is maybe even stronger because of the protests that we were witnessing for so long, and because the EU response or EU Commission response was not adequate. There were some responses from the EU Parliament, European Parliament, but those responses came mostly from our neighbors and former brothers, that is Croatia and Slovenia, and thanks for that, but it's not enough. And in a way, what even the staunchest supporters of European Union, I would subscribe myself underneath that badge, became aware of is that there is a kind of transaction going on there, that the voices that are democratic voices, the values of whose are European values, and that is the students, are not being heard, and there must be a reason why that is not the case. So in a way, it is, I don't see a point that there is a response or reaction to what is going on after it finishes, as in Republika Srpska, what Irena just said, and but while it's happening, and there is not an adequate response to that, which created a lot of Euroscepticism among those who were supporters of European Union and Serbian accession to European Union, and created even stronger disapproval, let's call it that way, of European Union among those who were skeptical even before.
Thank you so much. I think we still have ample time for a second round of questions. And if you don't mind, again, I would go with a rather theoretical and rather practical and policy-oriented. Regarding the theoretical, Irena, I think you provided me a lot of food for thought. And I just would like to touch upon 2 points you made. The first one, that civil society, or potentially the society as a whole, would need to go beyond identity and be political. And in your first contribution, you actually described this current status or status quo of the proto-fascist society, that there is a fundamental disrespect or dismay for the weak, for the marginalized group who are treated as deplorables. And actually, due to this, unfortunately, we end up not in a society, but also in a constitutional reality, that fundamental rights are actually not shared equally by the citizens, but are treated as group rights for the ordinary people. And this is certainly the case with the freedom of assembly, but unfortunately, it's also becoming the case with regards to equal access to healthcare. So it really affects a lot of different areas of fundamental and citizenship rights. And here my question, whether you see any allies at the political scene, so mainly parties, the question is to all of you, who are not necessarily ideological allies in the sense that they share the identity or they support the struggle for identity, but that they are fundamentally concerned due to this breakdown of the concept of citizenship and what consequences it can have for the democratic and constitutional orders. So allies who are ready to protect and support because they see a breakdown of equality in the concept of citizenship. And the second question, Angel, you mentioned actually this transnational networking character of the cooperation between anti-gender organization, actually, yeah, across borders. It's in the concept of transnational. And here my question is whether you are aware of any forms of cooperation that go beyond the level of transnational learning. So institutional cooperation, resource sharing, etc. And whether you are aware of any initiative that started mapping of these networks. And whether you think that starting mapping of these networks and your cooperation activities would be of any good in the sense that potentially could provide resources that may potentially weaken the legitimacy of these attempts, because at the end of the day, they are also international networks which are undemocratic and try to influence actually the democratic politics of sovereign countries with potentially even illegitimate means and financing. And here my question, whether you are aware of any such forms of cooperation and any initiatives that try to map them. Thank you so much. And I don't know who would like to start.
Yes, I can
Go ahead.
by answering the first question about political allyship. Well, in North Macedonia, we thought we had political allies, and that somehow started from a wider, let's say, allyship we've been building under the colorful revolution. And these are the alliances, I think, that we are trying to maintain, that go beyond our identities, that center around a political issue. And to be very honest, some progression was made during the last mandate of SDSM. But also, I think that we have been very, let's say, soft in how accountable we held them for what was promised, and how these issues were treated later on when other issues started to rise. So I don't think at the very moment there is no political allyship on this front. The right-wing voices are on the rise. Parties such as SDSM are totally losing their legitimacy. They are going to become, from the second most biggest party, they are going to become, I think, the third party. And the second party, which is called Levica, and is working on a far-right concept of this society, actually is the one who is going against the civil society sector and promotes ideas such as the foreign agents law. So I don't think that we can find true political allyship in the parties, but I think that what we have been trying to do is work with some list of independent councillors within the cities, for example. We have these initiatives, for example, that mostly work around the issues of environment, but they have been willing to step up and connect these to feminism. They show to pride parades. They are a very small minority of having 2 or 3 councillors inside the city of Skopje, for example. But we found that some kind of a middle ground with them when it comes to these issues. So this might be our only allyship at the moment, which is not big, but it's something. And regarding the transnational nature of the movement, I think it was last year or the year before that Alliance Defending Freedom had its first training in North Macedonia for anti-gender activists, which is a renowned anti-gender network having a lot of funds, and they come to countries where the movement is already, let's say, well established, and they are connected with other organizations such as Citizen Go, who fund awareness campaigns, referendums, even in some countries. And this was, I think, the first instance that we saw the transnational nature of the movement happening in our country. We had last year, we have organized a conversation with the UK author Sean Norris, who works largely on uncovering this network. So she's writing about the nature of the transnational organizing in her book Bodies Under Siege. So I highly recommend if anyone is more deeply interested in this. But Irena and Adriana can back me up that I'm not so sure that we have a clear map of our region, what is happening and how these influences are entering and how money are spent, etc.
Thank you, Adriana. Irena?
Can I jump in very shortly over the first question and back up, Angel, that we are at the start of this kind of comparative regional research on what is going on. The money is always the hardest to track, I would say. So, and it would be important to see where it comes from. I just wanted to say one thing about the allyship. Again, speaking from the position of the protest, which really changed the perspective completely of all of us. Why I'm saying this, Irena and I were together at the end of November in Belgrade at one event, feminist event, when our friend from Sarajevo, Emina Bošnjak, said that she believes it was an anti-gender event. I mean, we were talking about the topic, and Emina said something like, I believe in 4 years we are going to be over with this, and people, women, and all others will not accept to be fed with this. We are going to overcome. And I remember, as I was facilitating that event, I remember how I was at the same time astounded by what she said and felt very positive about that kind of faith that she had expressed at that point. However, what I wanted to say is that in a way, maybe Emina and people who think alike are right, because we who come from already certain kind of established position, established meaning being part of something, being part of a movement, being part of a civic scene, being part of the academic scene. We have our languages, what Irena was talking about. We have our already entrenched views on things, and we think that, that's how it is. However, then you see these younger people, such as the students, who all of a sudden seem to really have a different language already. So, for example, on the March the 8th, so the Women's International Day, what we had in Belgrade was a students organized March the 8th. That was the first time in the long history of Serbia and Yugoslavia that the students organized that day. It was incredible amount of people, incredible amount of men, women, and all others there. Everyone was in something purple because that was the color of the day. And the banners that appeared just, out of this internal organization were, among others, feminism and renaissance. Women are going to save the world, but also trans women are women. So in a way, something that we fight for as a language, they already have. And this was displayed with such ease as other things, other banners, other flags were displayed. So perhaps we should believe in allyships that are not visible at the level of identities, and maybe also try to look through identity or beyond identity lens as something which becomes really necessary, as identity as a term is starting to stifle us, I would say, on all levels.
Thank you. Irena?
I would completely agree. That was exactly my point when I said that we need to move beyond identity politics and beyond this single issue-based coalitions, and the student protests in Serbia are actually showing us exactly this. But to get back to the question, where can we find the allies? I agree. At this moment, it's very hard to name a group of people, professions or institution that can be an ally to the movement. But within these rigid institutions, we have always had allies. We have always had members of our communities in every institution, including the religious institutions. So what we now, at this beginning of this new strategizing, would be to offer people that we share values with, offer them support and space. So offer them means so they can be mobilized on our side. So it is a time when we really need a retreat. We need to stop always reacting towards our enemy and really rethink who are our allies. I talk a lot about new, fresh coalitions. And for the Western Balkans, even the coalition between civil society and academia is an unusual coalition. Adriana Arharivic really is a rare voice of the academia that has always been with us, has always been our supporter, but has a history of collaborating with the movements, with civil society. But she's a rare voice, as I said. Academians are usually rigid and conservatives. So just invest in our people within every institution. And you asked me at the beginning how we are going to do this. And I think what we really need to think is that after 4 years trying, me and Daniel, we were part of the same group called A Place for All, where we tested a lot of things. I think what I came out with is that we need, as I said, something new. And if I know what it is, then that's the wrong answer. And by this, I mean, so if you ask me how, I cannot give a recipe, but I would say invest in create spaces that will allow these unusual coalitions to happen, but also places where risking is allowed and experiments are allowed. And I know this is what donors hate. You always want everything planned, risk assessment, mitigation, and everything. But I'm sorry, we don't have the privilege. We don't have the privilege now. I'm sure we will have it in the near future. And then I remember the event that Adriana was speaking about. I think me and Adriana were the most pessimistic people on that event. We were going around like black clouds. But what really is happening, we see, as I said, these anxiety-based mobilizations, as I said, they lack vision. They cannot sustain. Yes, a lot of poor people, a lot of workers, even migrants vote for Donald Trump. It's not even a year after he was elected, they are disappointed. I read a very interesting meme. It says, well, World War III, it's kind of bad, but hey, it was either this or pronouns. And I think this is actually going to be the new dominant narrative for the anti-gender. But while this is happening, we should never forget that at this moment we need, as I said, time to rethink who were our allies. Corporations were never our allies. That's why they were eager to block the diversity, equity, and inclusion concepts within their corporation, or I don't know, some political parties were actually never our allies. And what we did in the past decades as a community, now I'm speaking, we really tried to be likable. And I think what is happening now in Hungary is showing us that this is the right way. You don't try to be likable, you don't try to comply with the world, but you antagonize. And I think if you ask me which pride parade is the most important now, I would say the ban parade in Hungary. And I'm sure it will happen, and I'm sure it will be the best Pride Parade, because people who will go there will be emotionally charged, will be angry, and they will know why are they on the streets.
Thank you so much. Actually, it's really hard to believe for me that at any panel, Adriana and you have been the most pessimistic speakers, because I think our today conversation was particularly engaging, insightful, and also very much forward-looking and constructive. So thank you so much to you all for this excellent panel. Angel, congratulations again for your great research. And actually, as a closing, just allow me to take a quote by Dan Savage, what I read in Angel's paper and what I found very, very motivating. And I think it is really an important takeaway, both for gender activists and democracy defenders alike, pretty much well describing our current emotional state. And it sounds that right now it doesn't feel like we can win, but we can. So having said that, I think good luck for all participants of the band parade, as you mentioned, in Budapest in 2 days. And dear friends, dear colleagues, thank you again for joining us today. Have a wonderful day and goodbye.